series, or my series on the Uralic languages, we go to my native language, Finnish. There are different estimates on how many people speak it. According to this Wikipedia article, the native speakers of Finnish were estimated to be about 5.4 million between 2009 and 2012. And of course there are questions on whether such non-standard dialects of Finnish, which are clearly influenced by another language, such as meänkieli, or our language in northern Sweden, kveeni, or the Finnish dialect, or Finnic dialect, or language spoken in northern Norway, or then various forms of Fingliska or Fingelska, Finglish, in other words, a mixture of Finnish and English, spoken by Finnish immigrants to Canada and the United States, and their descendants who still speak Finnish to some extent. And likewise then, whether the Ingrian dialects, natively spoken still by some people, although a diminishing number in northwestern Russia, whether they should be considered as dialects of Finnish or separate languages. Likewise, there has been long debate, mostly a historical and political, or to some extent linguistic debate, as to whether Karelian proper, or White Sea Karelian, should be considered a dialect, albeit a notably archaic and non-standard dialect of Finnish. In the Finnish diaspora, Finnish is still spoken by thousands of people, or tens of thousands, or actually hundreds of thousands of people. The closest Finnish diaspora, of course, is in the western neighboring country, Sweden, where a sizable number of Finns started to move already in the 16th century, more specifically to the woods or forests of central Sweden in Värmland, Savonians and Karelians. And notably in the 1960s, and to a smaller extent 1970s, 1980s, and afterwards, Finns have moved to Sweden as well in pursuit of higher standard of living, better job opportunities, better educational opportunities, and so forth. Finnish is a member of the Finnic language family and is typologically between fusional and agglutinative languages. It modifies and inflects nouns, adjectives, pronouns, numerals, and verbs depending on their roles in the sentence, which means, of course, that the word order is rather free in Finnish, that for the sake of emphasis, the traditional or default word order subject, verb, object can be inverted or otherwise changed. The Finnic languages evolved from the Proto-Finnic language after Sami, or the Sami language, or languages was separated from it around 1500 to 1000 before Christ. The birch bark letter 292 from the early 13th century is the first known document in any Finnic language. The first known written example of Finnish was found in a German travel journal dating back to about 1450. Mynna tahton gernast spuho somen gelen emyna daida. Or in modern Finnish, minä tahdon kernaasti puhua suomen kieltä, mutta en minä taida. Or in English, I want to, or I really want to speak Finnish, but I am not able. According to the travel journal, a Finnish bishop whose name is unknown was behind the above quotation. Sweden started to gradually take over Finland, starting from the southwestern Finnish mainland in the 12th century. As the Swedish rule gradually became established during the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, and in northern Finland eventually in the 17th century, Swedish became the administrative language and also the language of any higher forms of education, although of course at the Finnish schools, the trivial schools and then the gymnasiums, Latin was taught as well. And then those who wanted to pursue career as priests had to learn as well Greek and some Hebrew, or it was recommended in any case. Mikael Agricola, who was, we could say, a linguist of sorts, although that was not his education, but by practical experience he came to dabble in linguistics because he had to create the most primitive standard form of Finnish literary language almost from zero. Only some small texts, no actual complete books had been published in Finnish before he started to write and then publish Finnish books in the 1540s. The alphabet book or ABC book, ABC-kirja, and then most notably the first Finnish translation of the New Testament, se vsi testamentti, meaning that New Testament. He wanted to introduce the definite articles found in, for example, Swedish and German, both of which he knew, but lacking in Finnish, but they never caught on. Se vsi testamentti, that New Testament, ne prophetat, those prophets, because he published also about 1/4 of the pages or texts of text length of the Old Testament in 1551 to 1552. His written language was based on Western dialects of Finnish. He himself was from the parish or town of Pernaja on Finland's southern coast, now belonging to the province of Uusimaa or Newland. However, he was inconsistent in his writing, and while the skilled contemporary Finnish or modern or postmodern Finnish readers like me can somehow understand his texts, they seem so clumsy and old-fashioned, and the orthography is clearly different from what it would be in modern Finnish. For example, he used DH or D to represent the voiced dental fricative th, as in the English word this, and TZ or Z to represent, or TZ or Z to represent the geminate voiceless dental fricative th, the th sound in thin. He also might use GH or G to represent the voiced velar fricative g, and either CH, C, or H for H. For example, he wrote tehtin, T-E-C-H-T-I-N, against modern spelling tehtiin, T-E-H-T-I-I-N, meaning was done. And gradually the spelling was simplified. Already the first full Finnish translation of the Bible in 1642 looked somewhat more readable, although often K was written as C, and TS was often written as TZ, and so forth, or sometimes even as DZ. However, the 1776 Finnish Bible translation already had dropped many of these archaic spellings. In the 19th century, such Finnish patriotic and nationalist leaders as the philosopher, writer, political scientist, and actually cabinet minister, finance minister Johan Wilhelm Snellman stressed the need to raise the status of Finnish. He was able to persuade the Russian Tsar, or Emperor, and therefore the Grand Duke of Finland, Alexander II, in 1863, to allow Finnish an official equality as a language that could be used on an equal footing with Swedish in the courts and in the government's offices, and with a 20-year transitional period. However, it wasn't until the early 20th century that Finnish received full equality with Swedish. And then Swedish remained well into the 19th century as the so-called civilized language of Finland. However, in the late 19th and early 20th century, quite many educated Finns whose names were Swedish Finnicized them, and then there were those Finns who even Finnicized their German names. For example, some Schilts became Kilpinens, an almost direct translation. Often the Finnicized names were not translations of the original Swedish names, but were taken from, for example, place names or literature, or sometimes apparently off the top of one's head. Mr. Elias Lönnroth, who earned his living mostly as a medical doctor, but also as a writer and a poem collector, did much to arouse the love of many Finns for their native language by publishing two poetry collections, the Kalevala, the Finnish national epic, and the less known Kantelettar, or lady playing the kantele or zither, a kind of simplified harp, which however is played when it's resting horizontally on a table or desk. The first novel written in Finnish and by a Finnish speaker was Seven Brothers, or Seitsemän veljestä, published by the hapless Alexis Kivi in 1870. And around that time started the period of modern Finnish, after which the language has changed progressively, especially since the 1950s, 1960s. It has acquired a number of English loanwords, and it keeps changing. And like many other languages, including English, it has many different forms. Rather few Finns speak consistently book language. They have short forms, colloquial forms, dialectal forms, and then those Finns who live abroad, such as myself, may mix words from other languages, although I try to speak, when I do speak, Finnish here in the Philippines, rather pure Finnish, whatever that means. The Finnish language has been changing in certain ways after the Second World War, which has been observed in the spreading of certain dialectal features and the Eastern disappearance of D sound. An example of the former metta, mettän, or metan, instead of the standard Finnish is metsä, metsän, forest, forests. And then an example of the latter, tian or tian, meaning I know instead of tiedän. And the simultaneous preference to abandon the more visible dialectal features. Some scientists have also reported the moving of the a sound, or a, with 2 dots above it, towards the a sound, or the standard a, even theorizing that the Finnish speakers would start to pronounce the a sound even more distantly from the changing a sound in order to preserve vowel harmony. Traditionally, Finnish has had its western dialects, southwestern, and then Satakunta, Tavastian, various Ostrobothnian dialects. Then the eastern dialects, mostly Slavonian and Karelian dialects, and then mixtures of these ones. It used to be that supposedly every parish or municipality of Finland had its own dialect or dialectal variation, but now, because of the great movement of people, especially from the countryside to the cities, and then between cities, and then, of course, movement of Finns, emigration of Finns abroad, especially to North America and Sweden, and then, especially since the 1990s, the arrival of many non-European immigrants, especially Africans and Asians, to Finland, that the Finnish language is in a constant state of flux, as any living language would be. However, since it has over 5 million native speakers, it is not threatened with even nearly as immediate extinction as some of its, or several of its related languages, such as especially Votic, well, Livonian, Votic, Ijorian or Ingrian, certain dialects of Karelian, and then several Samoyedic languages, and of course some Sami languages as well. Standard Finnish is prescribed by the Language Office of the Research Institute for the Languages of Finland and is the language used in official communication. However, it basically issues just recommendations. Of course, at schools, the teachers of the Finnish language and literature, and then of Finnish as a second language, do encourage or require, at least in tests and exams, the students and assignments as well, unless they give the permission to use dialectal Finnish to use these standard forms. But this institute is nowhere as strict as a similar institute in France, which has tried even to prescribe, to prohibit English loan words and loan terms where there are French equivalents. For example, show business should be translated as l'industrie de spectacle or l'industrie de film, maybe. The new Dictionary of Modern Finnish, or Kielitoimiston sanakirja, literally translated as the Language Office's or Language Bureau's dictionary, was published electronically in 2004 and printed in a printed form in 2006. A descriptive grammar was published in 2004. There is also an etymological dictionary and a handbook of contemporary language. Colloquial Finnish is very common in Finland, not just among the children and teenagers, but also among people of various other groups. Those who speak dialectal Finnish tend to be more middle-aged and especially older people, and particularly in the countryside and in the smaller cities, meaning in Finland cities with under 50,000 and especially under 30,000 people. But even they, because of, for example, the influences of mass media, are to some extent adopting these colloquial or even slang terms. Finnish is a synthetic language that employs extensive regular agglutination of modifiers to verbs, nouns, adjectives, and numerals. However, it is not a polysynthetic language, although non-finite dependent clauses may be contracted to infinitives, lauseen vastikka, or clause equivalent. For example, juodessani, when I was drinking or during my drinking. Finnish has a smaller core vocabulary than, for example, English, no wonder, because it has much fewer speakers, whether native or non-native ones, and uses derivative suffixes to a greater extent. For example, the word kirja, which means a book, such words as kirjain, a letter of the alphabet, kirje, a letter, kirjasto, a library, kirjailija, an author or writer, kirjallisuus, literature, kirjoittaa, to write, kirjoittaja, a writer, kirjuri, a scribe or a clerk, kirjallinen, literary or in written form, kirjata, to write down, register, record, kirjasin, a font, and many others are derived. And there are various suffixes such as ja, agent, one who does, lainen, inhabitant of, sto, collection of, in, instrument or tool, yri, an agent or instrument, us, result of some action, tön, lack of something, linen, with double L, having, kas, similar to, linen, va, doing or having something, la, a place related to the main word. For example, istua, to sit down, istun, I sit down. And in Finnish, as for example in Estonian and Hungarian, and then in such world languages as Spanish, it is not necessary always to use the personal pronouns if the verb forms happen to be correct. But then for the sake of emphasis, or to be more polite, then the personal pronouns can be used, and especially then the proper names, because the third person singular hän pronoun, which often is se in non-standard colloquial Finnish, ironically se also means, for example, an animal or a thing or an object. So hän can mean either a boy or a girl, a man or a woman, and then sometimes in order to avoid confusion, proper names are used. Or then common nouns such as poika, boy, mies, man, tyttö, girl, nainen, woman. The Finnish language has borrowed many words from a wide variety of languages, most from neighboring Indo-European languages, such as especially Swedish, to a lesser extent from Russian. And then many, for example, German and French loanwords have traveled via Swedish, because Swedish was for such a long time the so-called book language or civilized language of Finland. Then there have been loanwords from Indo-Iranian, Turkic, Baltic, well, as I mentioned, Germanic, and then Slavic languages. Germanic languages, mostly Swedish and German. Slavic languages, a great majority of them from Russian proper. Then kuningas, which means king, and ruhtinas, sovereign prince or high-ranking nobleman, have been borrowed from Germanic kuningats or kuningas, and druhtinas or druhtinats. Then English, of course, has been a major source of borrowing, especially after the Second World War, and especially since the 1960s, when English started to become the favorite foreign language to study, gradually then replacing German and French. Although because of the Finnish membership in the European Union, French has to some extent held its own, but German seems to be declining as a studied language to some extent because of the increasing number of Russians and Russian speakers in Finland. Russian has been adopted as an elective language, especially by people living close to the Finnish-Russian border in southeastern and eastern Finland. And then more exotic languages, if you want to call them, those such as Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, to some extent Arabic, to a limited extent Hebrew, and so forth. Neologisms, or neologisms. Some modern terms have been synthesized rather than borrowed, for example, puhelin or telephone, an instrument for talking, literally translated. Tietokone, literally knowledge or data machine, computer. Levyke or diskette, from levy or disk, and then the diminutive ke. Sähköposti, literally electric or electronic mail, email. Linja-auto, literally line car or route car or bus. Muovi or plastic. And then, well, for example, lentokone, literally flight machine. Finnish distinguishes between the long and short vowels, and the long vowels are written as double letters, whether they be double A, double A with two dots above it, double E or E, double E or I, double U, which means U in Finnish, double O, double U, two Y's together, and double Ö, two O's with two dots above each one, or above both of them. Interestingly, that famous 20th century British professor, linguist, and writer, fantasy book writer J.R.R. Tolkien had a keen interest in languages from a young age and became a professional philologist. And he, to some extent, borrowed sounds or phonemes from Finnish, especially to construct the so-called Elvish Latin language, or Quenya. For example, the word for, I'm going to have to check this, one of the three magical rings of the elves, Vilja, spelled with the capital V-I-L-Y-A, meaning air. However, it's pronounced exactly the same way as the Finnish word for grain, vilja, which is written according to the nearly phonetic standard Finnish style V-I-L-J-A. He described his first encounter with Finnish, so J.R.R. Tolkien, like discovering a complete wine cellar filled with bottles of an amazing wine of a kind and flavor never tasted before. It quite intoxicated me.